The last train rattling through the city core smelled of damp pavement and industrial grease. Zara Johnson had only 3 stops left, but her body felt heavy with an exhaustion that went deeper than bone. Double shifts at the diner, 16 hours on her feet, and the lingering scent of cheap fryer oil clinging to her uniform. To her, the train was just a sanctuary of plastic seats and flickering fluorescent lights. She didn't see the man in the tailored black suit sitting at the end of the car. She didn't notice the way his intense, dark eyes cataloged her every movement with the lethal precision of a predator. She certainly didn't register the danger radiating from his unnaturally still posture. Welcome back to Afro Underworld Empire. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to follow this journey of high stakes and hidden hearts. Tell us in the comments, have you ever fallen asleep in the wrong place at the right time? Joon-Seok Kang was not a man people sat next to. Those who knew his name knew better than to enter his line of sight. But tonight, Joon-Seok was undercover, his mind focused on a target blocks away, his hand resting near the dragon tattoo that spiraled beneath his collar. Then, gravity took over. Zara's head tilted, her curls brushing against the expensive wool of his shoulder as she fell into a deep, defenseless sleep. He could have moved. He could have let her slump against the cold window glass. He could have maintained the iron discipline that kept him untouchable and alone. He didn't move. Instead, he signaled his men to continue the mission without him. That single choice, to let a tired waitress use a Mafia king as a pillow, would be the moment that unraveled his entire world. The 2:15 a.m. train was a hollowed-out shell of metal and flickering neon, a purgatory for those the city had finished with for the day. Zara Johnson moved down the aisle with the heavy, uncoordinated gait of someone walking underwater. Her brown apron was stained with a constellation of coffee spills and grease, and the muscles in her lower back screamed with every jolt of the carriage. She didn't look for a seat as much as she surrendered to the nearest one, her messenger bag hitting the floor with a dull thud that mirrored the rhythmic pounding in her temples. Outside the window, the Seattle skyline was a smear of weeping lights, the Space Needle a distant, indifferent ghost watching over the wet pavement. Zara leaned her temple against the cool glass, her eyelids fluttering as she fought a losing battle against the crushing weight of 68 hours of labor. 4 seats away, Joon-Seok Kang sat in a silence so absolute it felt like a physical barrier. He was a man of sharp lines and expensive wool, his black suit jacket draped over broad shoulders that never seemed to relax. While the rest of the car's occupants were slumped in various states of disarray, he remained upright, his dark eyes fixed on the reflection of the car door, tracking the shadows of the mission he had been forced to pivot away from. He was used to being the predator in the room, the one who moved through the world untouched and feared. The train took a sharp curve near Columbia City, and the sudden shift in momentum was the final blow to Zara's resistance. Her body went limp, her head rolling away from the window as gravity and bone-deep fatigue finally won. She didn't fall toward the empty seat. Instead, she tipped sideways, falling like a stone dropping into dark water until her head landed heavily against Joon-Seok's shoulder. The contact was electric, a sudden jarring intrusion of warmth into his cold, calculated reality. Joon-Seok's first instinct was a violent recoil, a reflex born of years spent ensuring no one ever got close enough to strike. But as he looked down, he didn't see a threat. He saw a woman whose breathing was already deep and rhythmic, her soft curls spilling over his lapel, and the scent of cocoa butter and restaurant fryers drifting up to meet him. She was completely defenseless, trusting a stranger with the weight of her life, because she simply had nothing left to give. He looked at the ink of the dragon tattoo peeking from his collar, then back at her peaceful, exhausted face. For the first time in 17 years, the Mafia king didn't move. He stayed still, a silent sentinel in a suit, letting the girl who had nothing lean on the man who had everything but peace. The vibration of the phone in Joon-Seok's pocket was a jagged intrusion into the heavy silence of the train car. He didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the reflection in the window, watching the way Zara's breathing slowed into a deep, rhythmic slumber against his shoulder. She was a ghost of a girl, worn thin by a world that took more than it gave, and her warmth was an anchor he hadn't asked for. With a movement so subtle it barely disturbed a single curl on her forehead, he withdrew his device. The screen glowed with a message from Min, positioned 3 cars ahead. Target is moving. We're exiting at the next stop. Where are you? Joon-Seok looked at the girl. If he stood up, her head would hit the hard plastic of the seat with a sickening thud. If he woke her, the terror of her situation, falling asleep on a man whose hands were stained with the shadows of the underworld, would shatter the only moment of peace she'd likely had in weeks. He looked at her wrinkled apron and the slight tremor in her hands, even in sleep. His thumb hovered over the glass. He was a man of logic, of logistics, of clinical efficiency. His father had built an empire on the rule that weakness was a terminal illness. But as the train slowed for the next station, Joon-Seok typed a command that defied 17 years of training. Extraction aborted. Continue the trail alone. Do not lose him. I am staying back. The reply was instantaneous. Boss, this isn't your style. Joon-Seok deleted the thread and slid the phone back into his pocket. He shifted his weight, not to pull away, but to provide a more stable angle for her head to rest. He was effectively guarding a stranger, a woman who smelled of cocoa butter and exhaustion, while his enemies moved through the night. The doors hissed open. He watched his men filter onto the platform from the other cars, their eyes scanning for him, their confusion masked by professional neutrality. They didn't see him tucked into the shadows of the last car. As the doors sealed shut and the train lurched forward, Joon-Seok felt a strange, quiet clarity. He had surrendered his mission for a moment of human contact he couldn't afford. He was a predator who had chosen, for one night, to be a shield. The transition from the rhythmic rocking of the train to the heavy, absolute stillness of the room was the first thing Zara noticed as her consciousness flickered back to life. She didn't open her eyes immediately. She was too busy registering the impossible softness beneath her cheek and the scent of sandalwood and expensive soap that had replaced the metallic tang of the Seattle Transit line. When she finally blinked, her heart performed a violent somersault in her chest. She wasn't on the train. She wasn't in her cramped apartment in South Seattle. She was lying on a leather sofa in a room that looked like it belonged in an architectural digest, vaulted ceilings, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the rain-slicked lights of Capitol Hill, and a silence so profound it felt expensive. "You're awake," a voice said, low and resonant. Zara bolted upright, her wrinkled brown apron rustling loudly in the quiet space. Her hand flew to her throat, her pulse hammering against her skin. Joon-Seok Kang was standing by a massive mahogany desk, his black suit jacket discarded, his dress shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the dark, intricate ink of a dragon's tail coiled near his collarbone. He looked unnaturally still, his dark eyes watching her with a calm that was more intimidating than a raised voice. How did I get here?" she stammered, her voice raspy from sleep. "I was on the train. I fell asleep on." The memory hit her with a wave of heat that flooded her face. She had used this man as a pillow. "You missed your stop," Joon-Seok said, moving toward her with a measured, predatory grace that made her breath catch. "And the area around the station at that hour isn't safe for someone who can't keep their eyes open." Zara looked at the luxury surrounding her, then back at him. He was a man of sharp jawlines and thick, intense eyebrows, looking every bit like the classic power players she'd seen in dramas, yet there was a coldness in his expression that suggested he was something much more dangerous. "You brought me to your house? I don't even know your name." "Joon-Seok," he replied, stopping at a respectable distance. "And you are safe here, Zara." The way he said her name, like he had already catalogued her entire existence, sent a shiver down her spine. She looked at her work shoes, then at the elegant watch on his wrist. The contrast between them was a physical ache. She was a waitress whose manager skimmed her tips, and he was a man who looked like he owned the shadows of the city. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead. And for the first time in years, the crushing weight of her exhaustion felt like it was finally being held at bay by the walls of this gilded cage. The silence of the room was heavy, broken only by the soft clinking of ice in a glass as Joon-Seok turned back to his desk. Zara sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her fingers nervously picking at the frayed hem of her brown apron. She felt small in the vastness of the estate, a sharp contrast to the man who commanded the room with a mere glance. "Why are you so exhausted, Zara?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull the truth from her. "It isn't just the late shifts." Zara looked down at her hands, the skin dry from constant dishwater and industrial soap. "My manager. He's been doubling my sections for weeks," she whispered, the honesty pouring out of her like a dam breaking. "He tells the owner he's hiring more staff, but he just pockets the extra payroll funds for himself. He knows I can't afford to quit, so he pushes me until I can't even stand. I have bills, and he uses that like a leash." Joon-Seok's jaw tightened, a subtle ripple of muscle that was the only outward sign of his rising cold fury. He knew men like her manager, small-time parasites who bled the vulnerable to line their own pockets. To Joon-Seok, who moved empires and shifted international borders, this was a petty sin, but seeing the toll it had taken on the woman who had leaned on him for a single moment of rest made it personal. "He thinks he's clever," Joon-Seok said, his eyes darkening until they looked like obsidian. "He thinks no one is watching." "Please don't do anything crazy," Zara said, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and a strange, budding hope. "I just need a job. I just need to be okay." "You are safe here," he repeated, his tone final. "Eat something, sleep. The world outside will look different when you wake up." As Zara was led to a guest suite by a silent, watchful staff member, Joon-Seok picked up his phone. He didn't call the police. He didn't call a lawyer. He called a team that specialized in audits of a different nature. Before the sun would rise over Seattle, the man who had exploited Zara would find his bank accounts drained, his records exposed, and his career ending in a way that left no room for recovery. Joon-Seok Kang didn't just protect what was his. He dismantled anything that dared to harm it. The heavy, velvet silence of the guest suite eventually became too much for Zara. By the second day, the restlessness of a woman who had spent her life on her feet took over. She followed the scent of toasted sesame and simmering bone broth down a winding corridor until she found the heart of the estate, a professional-grade kitchen that hummed with the quiet efficiency of a laboratory. The head chef, a stern Korean woman named Mrs. Park, didn't stop her prep as Zara hovered in the doorway. "You're the one from the train," Mrs. Park said without looking up, her knife moving in a blurring rhythm against a head of Napa cabbage. "I can't just sit there," Zara admitted, her voice small. "I'm used to working. Please let me help with something, anything." Mrs. Park paused, eyeing Zara's hands. She saw the familiar calluses of a service worker, the muscle memory in the way she stood. With a curt nod, she pushed a crate of garlic toward her. "Peel." Zara sat on a high stool and set to work. The repetitive motion was a balm to her frayed nerves. For hours, she worked in silence alongside the staff, eventually graduating from garlic to julienning vegetables. She moved with a grace born of 1,000 dinner rushes, her focus so absolute that she didn't notice the heavy oak door swing open. Joon-Seok stood in the shadows of the arched entryway, watching her. He had traded his suit for a black silk shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink that crawled from his wrists to his forearms, intricate scales of a dragon that seemed to shimmer in the kitchen's warmth. He was a man who lived on the edge of betrayal, yet here was a woman who had every reason to run, instead choosing to find peace in the simple act of preparing food for his household. "She has the hands of someone who respects the craft," Mrs. Park noted, finally looking at her boss. "She doesn't waste a single movement." Zara looked up, her face flushed from the steam of the pots. She saw Joon-Seok watching her, and for the first time she didn't see a predator or a captor. She saw a man who looked profoundly tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix, a mirror of her own soul. "I didn't mean to intrude," Zara said, wiping her hands on a fresh white apron. "You aren't intruding," Joon-Seok replied, his voice softening. "You're the only person in this house who isn't afraid of me." He stepped into the light, the ink on his arms visible as he reached for a piece of fruit Zara had sliced. The tension between them wasn't the sharp edge of danger anymore. It was the slow, simmering heat of two people from different worlds realizing they spoke the same language of survival. The following morning, the kitchen was quiet, but the air felt charged with an invisible shift in the atmosphere. Zara was at the counter, her natural curls pulled back, working on a tray of dumplings, when Joon-Seok entered. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and his black dress shirt was unbuttoned at the cuffs, revealing the dark, winding tail of the dragon tattoo on his wrist. He didn't speak at first. He simply slid a sleek, tablet-sized folder across the marble island toward her. "What is this?" Zara asked, her brow furrowing. "The results of an audit," Joon-Seok said, his voice cold and precise. "Your manager at the restaurant, Mr. Henderson, is currently being detained. It turns out that skimming from the payroll was the least of his crimes. When the authorities were tipped off to his tax inconsistencies and the secondary set of books he kept in his floorboards, they found everything." Zara opened the folder. Inside were photos of her former workplace behind yellow tape and a digital printout showing a series of wire transfers. Her eyes widened as she saw her own name on a list of employees slated for back pay restitution. How did they find all this so fast?" she whispered, looking up at him. Joon-Seok leaned against the counter, his presence looming and powerful. "Men like that are sloppy because they think the people they hurt are too tired to fight back. They assume no one is looking over the shoulder of a waitress. They were wrong." Zara felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold. She realized then that Joon-Seok hadn't just made a phone call. He had dismantled a man's entire existence in the time it took her to sleep off a double shift. The relief was overwhelming, but it was shadowed by a new realization of just how much power the man standing in front of her possessed. He had saved her from a predator by being a much larger, more sophisticated one. "He won't be coming back," Joon-Seok added, his gaze softening as it landed on her face. "And the owner has been convinced to wire the full amount of your stolen wages to your account by noon today." Zara looked at her hands, the hands that were no longer shaking from exhaustion. "You did all this for me. We're strangers." "We were," Joon-Seok said, stepping closer until the scent of his sandalwood cologne enveloped her. "But I don't like seeing things that are valuable being treated as if they are disposable." The gratitude in Zara's chest was heavy, a strange ache that made her want to reach out and touch the ink on his arm. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances, but she was now part of a world she didn't fully understand, bound to a man who broke the world to keep her safe. The dining room was a cathedral of shadow and candlelight, a space designed for power plays and silent negotiations. Tonight, however, the long mahogany table had been shortened by intimacy. Zara sat across from Joon-Seok, her skin glowing against the cream silk dress he had provided, a stark departure from the stained apron of her former life. The meal was a blend of their worlds, spicy Korean stew and soul-comforting sides that Zara had helped Mrs. Park prepare. Despite the elegance, the air was thick with an unspoken weight. The silence wasn't empty, it was charged, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Zara watched the way the candlelight caught the sharp edge of Joon-Seok's jaw and the dark ink of the dragon tail peeking from his cuff as he moved. "You've been quiet tonight," Joon-Seok noted, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a directness that made her heart skip. Zara put down her silver chopsticks, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just trying to understand. Why me? You could have anyone. You live in a world of marble and silk, and I'm just a waitress who didn't have enough money for a taxi." Joon-Seok set his glass down, the wine swirling dark and red. He didn't answer immediately. He stood, walking the length of the table until he was standing just behind her chair. The scent of sandalwood and rain enveloped her, a sensory reminder of the night they met. "You think your value is tied to your bank account or the title on your name tag," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register near her ear. "But I have spent my life surrounded by people with titles who have no soul. On that train, you were the first thing I'd seen in years that was real. You worked until you broke, yet you still have a kindness that hasn't been extinguished." He reached down, his fingers grazing the skin of her shoulder, lingering just above the silk strap of her dress. Zara shivered, not from cold, but from the sheer intensity of his proximity. "I didn't choose a waitress, Zara," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her collarbone. "I chose a woman who is stronger than any soldier I employ, someone who sees the man behind the ink and doesn't flinch." Zara turned in her seat, looking up at him. The danger was still there. She could see it in the way he stood, the way he watched the door. But for the first time, the fear was gone. In its place was a magnetic pull, an impossible gravity that drew her toward the very man she should have been running from. The candle light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows of the dragon across Joon-Seok's chest as he stood over her. Zara looked up, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. The opulence of the room, the fine crystal, the silk dress, the silent staff, felt like a dream she was afraid to wake from, yet the man before her was undeniably, terrifyingly real. "I'm a waitress, Joon-Seok," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I spent my mornings scrubbing grease off counters and my nights counting nickels for the bus. You belong to a world that moves cities. Why would you want someone who has nothing?" Joon-Seok reached out, his hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted the lethal reputation he carried like a shroud. His thumb traced the line of her lower lip, his dark eyes searching hers. "You think you have nothing because your pockets were empty," he murmured, his voice a low, rough velvet. "But I have spent my life surrounded by people who have everything and are worth nothing. They are hollow, Zara. They are echoes of their own greed." He stepped closer, the heat radiating from him, enveloping her. "You have a spirit that hasn't been broken by the weight of this city. I watched you in the kitchen with Mrs. Park. You work with a dignity that my soldiers don't understand. You care about the quality of a meal for people you don't even know. That is not nothing. That is the only thing that is real in my world." Zara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "It's dangerous, being near you. I've seen the way people look at you. I've seen the ink. I know you aren't just a businessman." "I am a man who does what is necessary to keep his world standing," Joon-Seok admitted, his gaze hardening with a flicker of honesty. "And right now, you are the only part of that world I want to keep untainted. You aren't just a waitress to me, Zara. You are the piece I thought I'd lost 17 years ago." He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. The silence between them was no longer a barrier but a bridge. He wasn't asking her to join his empire. He was asking her to be the reason he came home from it. For Zara, the choice was becoming clear. She could return to the safety of her old, exhausted life, or she could step into the beautiful, terrifying unknown with the man who had chosen to be her shield. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the estate, casting long, clean lines of light across the marble floors. It was a different kind of morning for Zara. There was no jarring alarm, no frantic search for a clean uniform, and no dread of the 16-hour grind ahead. Instead, there was a profound, quiet stillness. She found Joon-Seok out on the wide terrace. He was dressed in a simple black sweater, the sharp edges of his public persona softened by the morning light. He was looking out over the city he helped rule, but as soon as the glass door slid open, his attention shifted entirely to her. He didn't say a word, he simply waited. "I went back to the restaurant last night," Zara said, stepping up to the railing beside him. "Just to see." Joon-Seok's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "And it's different. There's a new manager. The atmosphere is lighter. People are actually smiling." She looked at him, searching his face. "You didn't just fix my life, you fixed it for everyone there." "I removed a parasite," he said simply. "The rest was their own doing." Zara looked out at the skyline. "I realized something while I was standing there. For years, I thought being safe meant being invisible. I thought if I just worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, the world would leave me alone. But the world didn't leave me alone. It just used me." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with a new kind of resolve. "You're dangerous, Joon-Seok. I know that now. I know that staying with you means I'll never have a normal life again. But for the first time in my life, I don't feel invisible. I feel seen." Joon-Seok reached out, his hand resting on the small of her back. The touch was firm, a silent promise of protection. "I cannot offer you a life without shadows, Zara. My world is built on them. But I can promise you that you will never have to carry the weight of it alone." "Then I choose the shadows," she whispered, "as long as I'm in them with you." The tension that had defined their meeting on the train finally dissolved. There were no more double shifts, no more stolen tips, and no more bone-deep exhaustion. In the heart of a criminal empire, under the watch of a man the world feared, the exhausted waitress had finally found a place to rest. They stood together as the city woke up below them, two people from different worlds who had found a strange, impossible peace in the eye of the storm. Their story didn't end with a return to the ordinary. It began with the extraordinary. Because sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is the only one who knows how to keep you truly safe.